naughty bits. Okay? Once again, a key thing I want you to be able to do is to compare and contrast anatomy, function, life history traits among major clades of reptiles. And yet again, use the lecture and handouts as a guide for the level of detail. Okay? The reproductive anatomy varies substantially among extant reptiles. It is possible to paint with some rather broad brush strokes among different lineages of reptiles for how courtship occurs. And we'll briefly discuss some trends in reproductive effort. Remember, there are many different aspects of reproductive effort. You can look at the total effort, and also look at the investment per individual, how many individuals get reproduced. Again, is there a strategy of just have a whole bunch of eggs or a whole bunch of babies, or have fewer and bigger offspring, or potentially have fewer offspring and invest more in the way of parental care? Those are all different options, and you see many of those different options among these different groups. And then another topic we're going to cover very briefly today is clonal reproduction. It's important that you realize that this is not limited to extant reptiles, but we really do see some remarkable things popping up in extant reptiles, so I think now is a pretty good time to cover it, even though there are some species of fishes and amphibians that have clonal reproduction. And clonal reproduction is just extraordinarily rare in birds and mammals, if it occurs at all. Well, you should be pretty darn well versed in the phylogeny of amniotes and in reptiles in particular. So we're going to be referring quite a bit to handouts 12 through 14. So make sure you've got those available for quick reference. This phylogeny is on handout 12. And not all creatures on here have a penis. Some do, and some don't. Turtles, crocodilians, and squamates, as well as mammals, do have a penis. However, Spinodontia does not, and for all practical purposes, all extant birds do not. There are a few exceptions, so we can't say it's universal with any birds. So given this phylogeny, what is the most parsimonious explanation for the evolution of the penis?
Would it be primitive and then birds, and was it Spinodonts evolved to lead it?
Okay, we do need to be kind of careful about what you mean by primitive.
So where -1 is, it would have been present there.
Okay, but again, it's just really important to be clear about at what point you call something primitive versus derived. So one could just as easily say for this clade, perhaps the presence of a penis is a synapomorphy, right?
Okay.
So if you consider at this point in time, there's an evolutionary transition, and if that's your reference point, or if you go just a little bit earlier, that would actually be derived, right? So non-amniotes lack a penis. It pops up in amniotes. Okay, so one possibility is that a penis evolves here, and is that a sufficient explanation to explain this pattern? Who says yes, raise your hands. Who says no, raise your hands. Okay, well then, obvious follow-up question is, if not, why not? What do we need to do besides saying, okay, we have presence here.
It wouldn't make sense to say, oh, it doesn't have it, and then it's independently evolved on all these other different points, like at different times.
Well, we're not talking about a whole bunch of independent evolutions if we're saying it pops up here, are we? But we need to do something else to explain that distribution.
Avians had an ancestor that lost it.
Okay, so if we go with this scheme of it evolves here, if it's absent in apes, then there was a loss in apes. Okay, so there's another evolutionary step required to explain this. Is that sufficient? Somebody else?
If we lost its phenotype.
There, or perhaps ancestral to Sphenodontia, okay. But if we don't want to invoke any more acquisitions, and if I didn't give you any more information, then we'd say a gain here, a loss within apes, and a loss within Sphenodontia, okay? So it'd take a minimum of 3 evolutionary transitions to explain this distribution, okay?
It was a gain at number 1, a loss at.
Well, we can use this as a working hypothesis and one that is most parsimonious. But let's use that as a starting point rather than a finish point. So keep that in mind as a possibility. And we're going to go into a few more details and then see whether they support that hypothesis or if we may want to modify. Okay? You have all of this information for turtles, crocs, Sphenodontia, and squamates. Sorry, this is the old terminology for the order. It's Testudines now on your lecture handouts. So, besides different things going on with copulatory organ, interestingly, as we've seen in lab, there are some differences in the shape and orientation of the cloaca. Namely, in turtles and crocodilians, the long axis of the cloacal opening more or less goes from front to back. Okay? Whereas in tuataras and squamates, the lepidopters, or lepidopteromorph, depending on how far out you go, the cloacal opening is a slit-like structure that goes from left to right. So there we see a substantial difference, and notice that we've got this clade that includes all of this, and then we're talking about this popping up someplace over here as far as cloacal shape goes. Now, in that previous slide, we just talked about the presence or absence of a penis, and we didn't even consider are all penises created equal, okay? In turtles and crocodilians, there's a single median penis. In squamate reptiles, there are paired hemipenes that are actually contained within the tail, rather than being anterior to the cloacal opening. Okay? And you have this text from this slide on page 1 of your handout 14. Again, let's just kind of go into a little bit more detail of what these structures look like. The floor of the cloaca, the ventral portion of the cloaca, so this would be a left sagittal section through the rear end of the turtle. Again, rather primitive art. This would be the cloacal opening. And you sort of have a little bit of a bump on the ventral portion of this chamber. And as I mentioned briefly, then, this bump is going to be the copulatory organ. And of course, this is the cloaca, so the head of the animal would be over here. So the turtle penis is anterior to the cloacal opening. Another interesting thing about this copulatory organ in the turtles is that rather than this being a tube, an enclosed tube for conveying the sperm, when it's erect, there are folds within which the sperm are transported. Okay? So clearly that's very different from a mammalian penis, where the tube that transmits the sperm has no fissures in it. It's just like a pipe, basically. That's referred to as a seminal groove found in this structure. And you sort of have two aspects when you have a penis that's internal. In order to copulate, of course, it must be outside of the cloaca. And at rest, what is the posterior tip of the penis remains the tip of the penis when it's erect and protruding from the cloaca. And the enlargement of this occurs as a result of increased pressure of blood and a bunch of spongy-like erectile tissue that makes this moderately rigid. Okay? But then the flip side of that coin is once you stick the structure out, how do you get it back in? And it's not simply a matter of the fluid contents being released. In fact, there's a muscle with fibers that are more or less oriented longitudinally. And those fibers go into the penis and are able to pull this structure back in. Okay? So those retractor muscles in turtles are necessarily located anterior to the cloaca because they have to pull this structure forward to pull that back in. Now, there are some differences in the details, but as far as these very general features, the penis in crocodilians resembles that of turtles. Okay? Well, squamates have something extra. Namely, the males have two copulatory organs for reasons that virtually nobody is able to understand, because on top of that, only one of these copulatory organs is used during copulation. Okay? Now, of course, there are two reproductive tracts in female reptiles. So eggs have to be fertilized in each of those oviducts. But a single hemipenis in a squamate reptile actually has a bit of a Y shape. And once again, we see seminal grooves formed by folds in the enlarged structure. And there's sort of a Y-shaped pattern to those grooves for transmitting sperm to the left and the right reproductive tracts of the female. So here we have some different views on, you've got this illustration on page 2 of handout 14, although it's in black and white. So this would be at the upper right, a cross section through the tail. And then this is a sagittal section through the tail of a snake. And then here we have a section, a frontal section, okay? So this is a ventral view, and then this would be looking at, since this is looking at the other side, this would be the left side of the base of the tail of the snake and the right side. And in this diagram, it's showing how the hemipenis is everted in order for the males to copulate. And there are two muscles associated with the hemipenis of squamates. There are retractor muscles shown by these longitudinally oriented fibers. And are those retractor muscles just like the retractor muscles found in the turtle penis? The fibers are oriented longitudinally, they go into the penis, they retract the penis into the tail. Who says yes, raise your hands. Who says no, raise your hands. Well, why not?
These retractor muscles are pulling it posteriorly and the turtle pull it anteriorly.
Precisely, they're in the tail, they're not in the body. So even though they accomplish the same function of withdrawing the copulatory organ, they're located in substantially different regions in the body versus in the tail. Now there are some additional muscles that, again, this would be one hemipenis, this would be another. There's some additional muscles with fibers that more or less go around the circumference of these sac-like structures within which the hemipenes are housed. Okay? So if you have a sac-like structure, and if you have muscle fibers that go around the circumference of that and squeeze, what is a likely function of that? Squeeze on a tube,
Excretion.
or protrusion of the structure, okay? So it's gonna make what's inside the tube stick out, right? Think of squeezing a tube of toothpaste, okay? Apply pressure to that and the contents go out. So those muscles in green, the propulsor muscles, facilitate protruding the hemipenes. There's also engorgement as a result of blood pressure increasing the size and rigidity of the hemipenes. Okay? And here's just another section showing that within the hemipenes you have these longitudinally oriented fibers. And another interesting feature of this is that unlike the turtle penis, in the hemipenes of squamate reptiles, it everts when it protrudes. So at rest, this part of the structure that is the inside of the sac, when protruded, becomes the outside of the copulatory organ. And you can see all these odd little spine-like structures and so on. So yet another reason why it's handy to have this retractor muscle. So when you take your gloves off, a lot of times, how they kind of stick to your hands, especially if you're wearing rubber examination gloves in the lab or something, you take them off and it everts. Think of that as a mechanical analogy for what's happening with the hemipenes in the squamate reptile. And there are all kinds of different shapes and structures on the hemipenes. So in fact, they have often served as an important anatomical trait for reptilian systematists. We're trying to figure out who's closely related to whom, and sometimes there are actually distinct enough traits to distinguish between closely related species. Okay? So on your handout 15A, you've got a bunch, or excuse me, I believe it's handout 14. You've got a bunch of text that goes over what I just discussed. So how the squamate hemipenes function. Okay? Here are the tails of two snakes, not the tail of two cities, but rather the tails of two snakes. And both of them are similar overall size. So in snakes, you commonly refer to the snout vent length as the distance from the nose to the base of the tail where the cloaca is. And another name for the cloacal opening in snakes is the vent. Okay, so these two snakes had identical snout vent length. They belong to the same species. Any guesses which one's a male and which one's a female? Who says the top one is a female? Raise your hands. Who says it's a male? Raise your hands. Okay. And then presumably the other way around. So we sort of have a split verdict. What is different between squamate reptiles that are males versus females in the tail?
You got the hemipenes?
Males have hemipenes in the tail. That's an anatomical structure that takes up some space, correct? So if all other things were equal and you just added hemipenes to the tail, you'd expect what? A thicker tail where the hemipenes are. So what do we think now? Who says top one is a female? Raise your hands. Who says it's a male? Raise your hands. Okay. So actually, when you become, the shapes of tails in lizards and snakes, of course, depend on the species to which they belong. But once you actually become familiar with the overall size and shape of the tail for a particular species, commonly with a bit of experience, you can simply look at the tails and tell males from females. So when I go to outreach programs, little kids often ask, well, is it a boy or a girl snake? Because it's very tough to tell from external traits. But this is one of the features in snakes that is often externally visible. And it doesn't show up too well in this photograph, but interestingly enough, in this species of snakes, the males also have some spiny scales near the cloaca, but that's rather unusual. So indeed, females top, males at the bottom. So you commonly see some sexual dimorphism in the tail anatomy of nearly all squamate reptiles. Okay? Now I'm going to be painting with some very, very broad brush strokes here to sort of keep that in mind. There are all kinds of departures and so on. But if we think of extant reptiles on a grand scale, I think it's fair to say that a whole bunch of them during courtship use tactile cues as well as olfactory communication. Okay? And a lot of reptiles have
see you later, not having Wi-Fi in your morning. Hello, small problem. It's okay, not start gathering. Hello, Google Fi.
So a lot of reptiles and snakes in particular have extremely well developed sense of
A
smell.
lot of children are a little more willing to.
This is a garter snake den
Sometimes
in
the
Canada where there are some limestone sinks
that it's almost like a pure snake.
that create fissures and little caves
not like snakes.
within which the snakes congregate and hibernate. And during the spring, there's a mass emergence before the snakes disperse,
Here in the inner lake of.
and they mate before dispersing.
Largest aggregations or concentrations of snakes anywhere in the world.
the inner lake of Manitoba is so plentiful, or why snakes are so plentiful here, really goes down to the geology of the area. Temperatures can reach 50 degrees below zero. And so a snake, being a cold-blooded animal, they have to be able to survive those winter temperatures. So that here in the inner lake region, the limestone bedrock is very close to the surface. And so that allows the cold and the water to crack and fissure the limestone. And it makes great big sinkholes. And that enables the snakes to get below the frost line during the winter. There's a very limited number of these den sites. So all the snakes in an area have to go to that den site that's in their region. And so that's how you end up with literally tens of thousands of snakes being in a sinkhole that might be the size of the average person's living room. It is actually very difficult for the males to find a female because if you look from a snake's eye view, you just see kind of a sea of living spaghetti, and you're looking for a slightly bigger piece of spaghetti
Okay,
than
notice
all the rest of them.
That larger head right there,
Females,
That's the females.
males are very easily able to then go past all.
see how much bigger the female is than those males. All those males are rubbing, they're using tactile cues.
Of these courting males.
During
all
courtship.
around one female trying to be that lucky guy that's gonna mate with her.
So again, this is the female.
Wrapped up, they can tumble downhill literally like a ball, so people call them mating balls. Even though there's tremendous competition.
And then you see the tongues commonly being flicked out. The tongues pick up odor particles. The tongues don't have the chemosensors within them, but they convey odor particles to the roof of the mouth. Like Jacobson's organ has fantastic ability to discriminate different chemical cues.
Look at me smile.
And there appear to be some chemical cues conveying the identity of females in their skin. The males are able to pick up, okay? So that's, again, reasonably common. You could see all of that close contact during the courtship process. And that's also quite a spectacular example of where males are having to compete against each other for access to females. So lots of important things going on that were illustrated nicely in that video. Now, lizards very, very commonly have visual displays. There are not a whole heck of a lot of snakes that have visual displays. Of course, both lizards and snakes are squamate reptiles. And one structure that is commonly sexually dimorphic among male and female lizards is the presence of a dewlap, or a fan-like structure beneath the chin that can be extended by the male. So here we have another example. If you look at where in all the lineages this pops up, some pretty massive convergent evolution in this sexually dimorphic trait within lizards. Oh. No. And that happened before. Well, my apologies, I don't know why that is not working properly. But I do believe that that video is working just fine on the Canvas site. If it's not, please let me know. Okay? At any rate, these dewlaps, as indicated in your textbook very nicely, are often bright colors in a given area where you have multiple species of closely related lizards, once again, different species have different colors. So that can be a pre-mating isolating mechanism, as well as a structure that's simply being used to attract the females. So at rest, you wouldn't even know the males have this structure, but then this throat fan comes out. There are actually species-specific patterns for how long the throat fan is out, comes back. In some cases, it may go back and forth quickly. Another very common behavior that you see in the courtship of lizards, as well as during territorial displays, is head bobbing and even doing push-ups, if you will, with the anterior portion of the body, okay? I'm sorry I'm not better at being a lizard than I am, but try to use your imagination. And again, hop online and take a look at Anolis lizards in particular, are a wonderful example of that. Now, unlike Anuran amphibians, again, painting with very broad brush strokes, auditory cues are quite rare in extant reptiles. Some of the exceptions are kind of fun, but it's very important that you realize that these are exceptions. There are a number of male crocodilians that actually do produce sounds, and rather spectacularly loud sounds, and ones that carry for quite some distance.
Peace out, leaving home just to change my phone plan. Hello, switching from my.
It's really tough when crocodilian cell phones are out of the public area, so they may need to change their plan before they can get together with the female.
The mating season has arrived. This amorous male.
That low rumbling sound really carries for a long distance.
And performs his magnificent water dance to attract the suitors.
So this is the American alligator.
His bellows above water are audible. Underwater, the throaty vibrations he gargles forth are too low for human ears to perceive. But the rumble agitates the swat in a symphony of dancing waters. We're pretty sure this is the origin of the phrase, good vibrations. He's not just speaking good vibes, he's sending them off. He's oscillating like a radio transmitter, broadcasting on radio station MAT. Well, no surprise here. It worked. The female has been seduced by that basso rumble. Alligator foreplay, yeah, snout growing. That's how he shows he's a lover.
Again, notice the tactile cues being used. It's not just auditory cues. Okay? A little bit corny, but some pretty good footage there, illustrating how crocodilians do court. Okay? You may be aware that some geckos can vocalize. Again, we see some of these vocalizations having dual functions of being involved in courtship as well as in territorial displays. That's a tokay gecko male calling, okay? Attempting to attract the female. Obviously, the video is not very good, but that sound is quite nice, okay? And then in some cases, there are sounds that don't seem to be so obviously derived, such as roaring and kind of making those vocalizations that geckos do. Because after all, if you simply have exaggerated respiratory movements, you can make a noise, and whether or not you sort of call that vocalization, it starts getting tricky. But in some of the large land tortoises, that's the male on top, there are sounds that are produced. Now, the extent to which those are important for making the female receptive, that's a little unclear, but pretty sizable sound production during copulation. Now, what is a problem that turtles encounter when the male is attempting to copulate with the female? What's unique about the body plan of turtles? The shell. What about the shell? Yeah, it's rigid, okay? And in land tortoises, they have a rather highly domed shaped shell. So think about that. That presents a bit of a problem if you try to put a flat surface onto a spherical structure. You know, that takes a lot of effort to balance potentially. And what might be something that would reduce this problem? Something that hopefully you noticed in lab when you were looking at different turtles, especially the more terrestrial ones.
Wouldn't have like the bottom shell to be like kind of like concave in or curved in.
Yes, so for many, especially for the more terrestrial turtles, you can often tell males from females just by flipping them over and seeing whether the plastron is flat. These photos are from box turtles, and you can see this handy dandy little impression in the ventral surface of the male shell to help with that mechanical problem of mounting the female. As far as I know, in virtually all turtles, the male is on top and the female is on bottom. Okay? Okay, so courtship occurs, you know, and then gametes get together, then what happens? One very noteworthy thing that's extremely common in many extant species of reptiles is that sperm can be stored for long periods of time. I'm sure you've read various accounts of human couples having problems conceiving and trying to time copulation just right so that sperm and egg are meet up at the right time. What's interesting though is if the female can store sperm, then you can actually have asynchrony in the reproductive physiology of the male and the female in species that reproduce seasonally, okay? If the females cannot store sperm, there's always this limited window in which the egg can be fertilized. Then you have to have this synchrony of when mating occurs with respect to the reproductive physiology of the female so that fertilization can actually happen. And I'm not just talking about, oh yeah, you know, a couple weeks, several days. In some cases, it can be years where there have been specimens in captivity that have been wild caught and they have produced viable offspring. Now, interestingly, there have been some recent accounts that have looked at the genetics of some of these offspring produced in captive reptiles that have found they actually weren't produced sexually, but that's a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the cases in which you get viable offspring a long time after any possibility for mating to occur. And in fact, some of the freshwater turtles found in our area, in around the upper Midwest, of course, they're inactive during the winter. And when you're an ectotherm, that's a bit of a problem if you can only be active for a fraction of the year. So an interesting thing there is that mating occurs before hibernation. And then, of course, during the early spring season, as temperatures are warming up, females ready to go because mating has already occurred and the sperm are being stored, okay? So an interesting example of how that can sort of give these critters a jump on the growing season, if you will. Now you have this information again on handout 14. It's so just sort of follow along there. We've briefly talked about these different ways of reproducing. Remember that in oviparous species, all of the dry biomass of the offspring comes from the eggs, and eggs are laid and developed outside of the body of the female. In ovoviviparous species, all of the dry biomass of the developing young still is derived from the yolk, but the eggs are retained in the body of the female. And exactly how long they're retained depends on the particular species, okay? And then in viviparous species, of course, development occurs inside of the reproductive tract of the female. And at least some measurable fraction of the dry biomass of the developing offspring cannot be accounted for by the dry biomass of the yolk. It's highly variable in species deemed viviparous among extant reptiles for how much of the biomass of the young is attained by means other than the size of the yolk when that egg is initially made. And we just see incredible numbers of independent origins of departures from ovipary within extant reptiles. So it shouldn't be too surprising, especially for viviparous species. We see a heck of a lot of variation in the complexity and details of the structure of the placenta. Okay. Let's see. We've got on handout 13, page 1, some phylogenies. And in the text of your handout, I've indicated certain taxonomic groups that are exclusively oviparous or exclusively viviparous. And for these different families, in some cases within a family, you can find both types of reproduction, eggs or having live young. So don't worry about frantically writing all of these down, but realize that in tuataras, they're exclusively oviparous. And then if we look at these different groups of lizards, good heavens, it's just all over the place. So I'm using an O to indicate oviparous and a B to indicate ovipary in something else. That could be ovoviviparous or oviparous and viviparous. Any way you cut it, if you have a distribution like this, you've just got massive, massive convergent evolution. And similarly, if you look within snake taxa, now the scolicophidians, those odd blind burrowing snakes that are specialists for eating ants and termites in the tropics, are exclusively oviparous. Pythons are exclusively oviparous, but then a big distinction between pythons and boas, the families, is that the boas are viviparous. The file snakes from Southeast Asia, which are fully aquatic snakes, are viviparous. And then we see both types of reproduction, vivipary and ovipary, popping up here. Another group of note is nested within the elapids. There's a subfamily of the live-bearing sea snakes, commonly referred to as the subfamily Hydrophiinae. And then these snakes, Laticaudinae, are the sea kraits. They emerge from water, Both groups have a paddle-shaped tail. These guys are oviparous, these guys are viviparous. So at least within snakes, one correlate of the evolution of vivipary is a highly aquatic lifestyle. Okay? Some additional correlates within some of the lizard taxa are sort of cold areas. And one thing that I find remarkable, there are some species of lizards in Europe where within a single species, different populations either bear live young or lay eggs. So this is a trait, for some reason, in an evolutionary sense, is incredibly plastic. Okay? Now, as I mentioned, another odd thing that pops up and is best exemplified in extant reptiles is clonal reproduction. And this is defined on your handout. In parthenogenesis, sperm are not necessary for anything. Okay, so no sperm needed. In gynogenesis, oddly enough, sperm are needed to initiate cell division of the egg. But in gynogenesis, the sperm do not contribute any chromosomes to the developing young. So all the developing young have identical genes to the mother, and these are all female species. So in both of these two, you've got all female species. And then in one of the more bizarre things, in hybridogenesis, you actually need sperm to initiate cell division in the egg. And the best example of this is a species of frog in Europe, a species of rhamid frog. There are two species that are very closely related. One species is the hybridogenic species. The other species has normal males and females. What's bizarre about hybridogenesis is that the chromosomes of the male of the closely related species do get incorporated into the offspring. But then when the offspring mature and produce gametes, all the gametes kick out the chromosomes from that male species. So you have clonal gametes that all come from mom's chromosomes. So if ever there was something bizarre, I think that's it, okay? Now, some additional trends that I mentioned earlier. I mean, how many young are there? How big are they? Again, it's important to keep track not only of numbers of offspring, but the relative sizes of those offspring. And of course, at one level, if you look at the investment of the female, it's that total biomass that the female has to reproduce and deal with that really is the burden on the female, okay? So, again, careful caveat, painting with very, very broad brushstrokes here. But if you think back to some of what we observe in fishes and amphibians, on average, you know, there are these notable exceptions like the plethodontic salamanders and amphibians, but a whole bunch of these species have hundreds and hundreds of eggs. And necessarily those eggs are quite small compared to the female, okay? But of course, how much this varies is going to be affected by the evolutionary lineage to which a particular species belongs. And for that matter, you can even find some trends within a species depending on how big the female is, okay? So if you lack any additional information, And if you saw female A bigger than female B, you'd expect that she'd probably have more offspring as a result of being bigger. And in turtles, they have anywhere from just a few eggs to about 3 dozen eggs. And this is a very, very common clutch size for one round of reproduction in turtles. Okay? Now, the common snapping turtle in the genus Chalaedra, as I'm sure you've seen in lab and in YouTube videos, is actually quite big. Sea turtles belong to Cheloniidae. They're huge. So not too surprisingly, they have massive numbers of eggs compared to sort of a generic turtle, if you will. Okay? Most crocodilian species are quite sizable, and some of them can have close to 100 eggs. And in lizards, a lot of them from about a half a dozen to a dozen eggs. And interestingly, there are quite a few small lizards, especially in tropical areas, that only lay 1 egg at a time. But many of those lizards live in areas with climatic conditions that allow reproduction to occur over a prolonged time. So in many of these species that only lay 1 egg at a time, they have multiple bouts of reproduction over the course of an entire year. The champion among lizards are some of the large monitor lizards. Think of the Komodo dragon, the world's largest lizard. It shouldn't be too surprising that they have large numbers of eggs. There are many species of snakes that have, maybe around a dozen to 3 dozen offspring. Some snakes may have nearly 100 offspring. And some of those are actually very sizable snakes, like anacondas, which belong to the Boidae and so on. But interestingly, there are also some snakes that are large for their lineage, the North American water snakes, such as the green water snake in southeast U.S. that have been documented to actually have over 100 offspring. And yet these snakes are only about 3.5 feet long. So necessarily, they're having a lot of very small offspring. Let's just wait till next time to polish off different things related to parental care, just to give you a little bit of a spoiler alert. Among extant reptiles, crocodilians are the champion when it comes to impressive amounts of parental care. Okay? And again, if some of you got here late, I have a bunch of old assignments I was going to give back to you. Let's make sure you get those.